ที่บอกก็คือกล่าวว่าไปมันถูกตัดมันมีบทครับ
Long time no see. Great. Well, hello and welcome everybody, both in person and virtual, to today's seminar in the Smart Mobility Connection series. My name is Maggie Harger. I'm the Women in Traffic 21 Transportation Fellow for the school year of 2021 to 2023. And the Smart Mobility Connection series is sponsored by the Traffic 21 Institute, as well as the Mobility 21 University Transportation Center, as an opportunity for faculty to showcase their current transportation projects. It's also an opportunity for students such as yourselves, fellow faculty, deployment partners, and the broader community to engage and network with researchers, highlight opportunities for involvement, and foster future interdisciplinary collaboration. Please note that this session is being recorded, so if you're online, your microphone will be muted. If you're in person, just keep your voices quiet. And then for those of you joining virtually, to ask questions, please send a message through the chat box. You don't need to wait until the end of the presentation to ask your questions. We'll ask them for you towards the end. So now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Sarah Fox is an assistant professor at CMU in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, where she directs the Tech Solidarity Lab. Her work examines how the deployment of AI within essential sectors reshapes existing work practices with focus on developing that center's workers' needs and expertise. So please help me welcome Sarah Fox. As well as
Martelaro.
Yeah. It's all good. Well, yeah, way to do it.
As well as Nick, as they're going to tell us about their project entitled Considerations on the Future of Human Automation Teaming in the Transit Workforce.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
So, hi everyone in the room and on Zoom. I'm Sarah Fox, as Maggie mentioned. I'm an assistant professor in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute here at CMU. And I'll be presenting with my colleague, Nick Martelaro, who's also in the HCII.
Yeah, so also an assistant professor in the HCII, where I work on understanding interaction design for autonomous systems, and with a specific focus on mobility and transportation-based systems as part of some aspects of my work.
We're going to be discussing some work that we've done as a part of the UCC funded project on the future of transit work. So some of this work is empirical, and the work that we're describing today is actually centered around a policy report. So a lot of the presentation draws from this recently released report on the effects of increasing automation within the context of transit operations. And so we'll give an overview of our recommendations in this talk, but I'd encourage you, we both encourage you to head over to this link if there are particular topics that pique your interest, or if you want more detail on any of the claims that we make. We can, of course, talk more at length about anything in the talk during the Q&A session, the discussion portion, but there's also more detail here. So it's tinyurl.com/transitworkforce. So today we're going to focus in, like I mentioned, on transportation operations. So beyond the individually owned and operated vehicles, which tend to capture most attention within popular press around AVs, in this report, we recognize a trend in highly automated commercial vehicle business models currently being tested within the US and across the globe. So driverless robo taxis, such as GM's Cruise, for example, are operating shared passenger vehicles commercially in San Francisco. And automated pods from companies like EasyMile allow slow speed transport of up to 12 passengers in relatively contained roadways, such as the Las Vegas Strip and college campuses. So kind of interesting juxtaposition in those settings, but relatively constrained. So these operations are increasingly moving toward or are already testing driverless deployment. In December of last year, EasyMile pods were approved to operate in France, for example. without a driver on board, and Cruise began its paid driverless taxi service in San Francisco in June. So seeing this move in commercially operated vehicles, we were prompted to examine similar trends in transit. So vehicle operation or automation has been applied in transit in closed systems such as rail bed or fixed track for many years. Although automation is common in rail, there's a significant jump in the level of complexity and risk when moving from closed to open road systems, like public roadways. So such complexities include interactions with varied infrastructure, other vehicles, and of course, vulnerable road users. So pedestrians and cyclists share the road with transit vehicles, and of course, it's important to ensure safety around those people. So in this policy report, we focus our attention on newer technology and applications of bus transit automation, specifically considering these heightened levels of complexity and risk. Literally, lives are on the line if we don't get this right. So here's a quick map displaying completed, current, and planned automated transit pilots within the US. Many transit agencies have received DOT funding for automated vehicle test activities, and some of this funding has been provided by the FTA and other projects funded under other modal administrators or by departmental programs. So overall, there's a significant investment, as you can see, across the United States. They're kind of spotty there in the middle, but a lot of kind of activity happening around piloting new automated vehicle technologies within transit. So these pilots will help to provide data on the applicability and viability and readiness of automated vehicle features in transit application, but we also suggest there's a need to study the impact on employment opportunities within transit, namely for operators and also maintenance workers and so on. So automation has the potential to both alleviate certain challenges and with driving tasks and augment safety, but it also introduces new challenges in work intensification, something we'll get into throughout this talk. So as we described already, operating transit is much more complex than light duty passenger vehicles. Buses are significantly larger and operate in variable environments nearby other road users. Driver assistance automation such as pedestrian warnings and lane centering do have the potential to improve safety and workload of transit operators, but at the same time, they can create new kinds of safety issues caused by interactions in human autonomy teaming and can intensify work when people primarily take over in cases of emergency or the need for quick response. Transit operations require supporting passengers and maintaining safety inside the vehicle as well as off. And we argue it's critical that public transit authorities preemptively consider the safety of incorporating automation technologies into their fleets, as well as to train operators to work effectively with these technologies. So today we reflect on two key recommendations that we present in the report. So the first is the need for research on the added work tasks and potential for new stresses placed on transit bus operators as new automation technologies are introduced. And the second, fourth in the report, is the need to support local authorities in conducting their own hazard analyses as a part of their public transportation agency safety plans.
Thanks, Sarah. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that actually can come up as with different types of technologies. So while there's a lot of focus on widespread deployment of highly automated vehicles, driverless technologies, there's a lot of challenges that still exist. As many people are seeing actually maybe in the news today, a lot of AV companies are even starting to scale back their claims to actually say, well, maybe it's not going to be 2020, maybe it's not going to be 2025, things like that, right? That being said, there's still talk and there's still opportunities to employ some technologies at different levels into transit automation and transit operations. Now, this being said, there's a number of challenges that we sort of see across different functions of the autonomous vehicle technology. For example, we're really interested in understanding how are these things going to be highly reliable in varying conditions. Of course, right now, a lot of operations for AV technology, they're happening in states that have good weather, right? Many of the things are occurring in places like Arizona, California. Of course, Uber was testing here in Pittsburgh, and they said if we can drive in Pittsburgh, we can drive anywhere. Uber is not driving in Pittsburgh anymore. It's challenging. There are many challenges to it. And so we're really interested in understanding that. Now, of course, buses run basically whenever, like they will keep running. Is it snowing? The bus is running. Is it raining profusely? The bus is running. Whereas you, maybe as a driver, you may decide, I'm just not going to go today, right? But the bus is actually going to run because a bus is actually critical infrastructure for, say, essential workers. And so there's a really interesting thing here where like the bus needs to go no matter what, basically. And so that becomes a really important aspect of the challenges that buses will face and transit will face with increasing automation. Another area is also, as Sarah had mentioned, was buses are maintained by a fleet of maintenance operators. They have staff. So I don't know if you've ever been to a bus yard or if you've seen a bus yard. There's whole garages full of trained people who are maintaining to make sure that these buses are on the road. Any downtime on a bus, of course, is lost to the business, which is, it is a business. And it's also, it really can cause an issue in many people's days who rely on this as critical infrastructure. And so making sure that the maintenance workers are trained up in the technologies and understand how to sort of work with these systems, the new sensor systems, the new computational systems, is going to be really important. We see potential challenges there if systems are introduced without consideration for such training. Another thing is actually just new job functions. One of the things is that operators now are primarily, they are bus drivers. They are trained, they have a commercial driver's license. They're trained to move a really big piece of equipment safely down the road at varying speeds. That being said, as automation becomes more prevalent, their role may change. We talk often about in autonomous vehicle is the shift from sort of operation to supervision. That's actually a really new way of working and something that needs to be considered and trained. And we need to consider the challenges that can arise. There's actually a lot of work that's been done in the aviation industry in the shift from pilots purely flying, everything to automation. And automation has really done wonderful things in aviation. It's made things safer. However, it's actually it did cause new stresses on pilots. People not being aware, people being kind of getting tired, because actually it's really hard to just pay attention and do nothing and wait for something to kind of change. Finally, there's also just a lot from the transit perspective is just costs. How much is this going to cost and how is that going to change the nature of service, right? Are you all, I don't know if folks in here are bus riders. If you're a CMU member, you have a free bus pass, but if you are paying for the bus, a relatively low cost. However, how much more are you willing to pay to know that there's this really cool fancy technology in there? Now, of course, that technology maybe it's safer, it may be providing you better service, but how much? There's a lot more that you have to consider at sort of the transit level, and you have to think about the customer base that you're serving. So I want to talk a little bit, I want to dive in a little more to that area of the burdens on transit operators. This really was related to that first recommendation. Something we're really interested in looking and we're currently researching now. We're actually speaking with bus operators, understanding what their daily lives are like, what is their work like. But there's a number of things that can occur that can really be challenging. We've got them listed here. One of them is automation surprise. This is when basically an automated system does something that you didn't expect. So for example, imagine that you're observing the vehicle and then the steering wheel sort of jerks because maybe a sensor saw something, maybe you didn't even see it. And it may actually be doing the right thing, but you actually get surprised. And interestingly enough, if you take over, you could potentially either cause an issue or it's doing something wrong and then you're surprised and then you try to correct it. A really good example of this, there was actually a case that happened where a driver was in a Tesla. They had fallen asleep. Their Tesla had actually started to pull over. It was warning them. They got flashes, started to pull over. Finally, it woke them up and alerted them, and they got scared, grabbed the wheel, and turned themselves into, I believe, a tree, unfortunately. Interestingly enough, in that case, had they actually just stayed asleep, the car probably would have pulled over. But this is the kind of thing that we, from our perspective as human-computer interaction researchers, we want to be thinking about this. How do we avoid those type of incidents? and how do we sort of make sure that the systems are aware of not surprising operators. Now, in the case of transit, one of the benefits that we have is that these are trained drivers. So whereas the rest of the kind of industry, or many parts of the industry, are thinking about everyday drivers, and mind you, at least in the US, drivers are trained to a degree, right? You had to take a driver test. Although I don't know when the last time, you all went through some driver training or took some, yeah. So think about the other people on the road. That is one of the benefits we have with transit. These people are certified. They actually, update their certification. So we can also think about training as a way to help avoid these issues. And that's actually what happens in aviation. Another issue, mode error. This is when a person doesn't understand what mode the automation is in. So for example, you can imagine a system, say, being in cruise control with adaptive lane keeping and lane centering. However, those systems may turn off. They may actually not be able to handle the situation for a number of factors. However, if an operator doesn't understand that the system is turned off, let's say they miss an indicator, or that indicator wasn't designed well into the system, then they'll think they're not going to know what level of automation they're in, and then that can lead them to be overly confident about what's happening with the vehicle. So that's another primary issue that can come up. Another one is authority control, and so this is where basically there's issues in how much control a person thinks they have versus how much control they're giving to a vehicle. This is also something we see with overconfidence, and it's quite interesting and surprising to see how quickly people will become fairly confident in an automated system. This is also an issue that occurs in something in aviation. Actually, a lot of the 737 MCAS crashes, for those who know, this was actually something where the systems, people thought that the planes were just like the planes that they had flown already. And they thought that the automation systems were working and the informational systems were working, and it wasn't the case. And that's actually one of the reasons why those planes actually crashed. And it wasn't due entirely to pilot error. Finally, another area of burden, which is interesting, and it kind of exposes itself over a long period of time, is called skill atrophy. So that's that last one here. Skill atrophy is something where people, if you're a trained operator, but then you start using automation, you actually start to lose your abilities, and you actually start to lose your reaction times, all the things that you were paying attention to, because you're just not using those muscles, both cognitively and maybe even physically. You're not actually doing that anymore. And this is something that we've seen with pilots. People actually they're slower to respond, and they can sometimes not respond as well. And so this is something that we want to consider, and this is a potential problem. However, it can be, with training or with sort of back and forth. Actually, if you fly in a plane, sometimes you may be able to feel when someone takes over and actually starts flying more manually. And so often that can be done so that pilots are actually just staying up to date, like they're just getting enough hours in of them manually flying, so they don't forget, they don't lose those skills.
I think another layer that's not featured on here, but also I think interacts with a lot of these, is the fact that interfaces on transportation buses are changing too. So there are kind of designs floating around without steering wheels, for example, which makes people nervous within the kind of transit world, nervous about kind of additional layers of complication on top of skill atrophy. So how do you, that muscle memory is affected even further when interaction modes changed.
Yeah, actually, Sarah, that's a great point. Speaking of vehicles that don't have a steering wheel, one of the things that we want to talk about are new kinds of crashes. So actually, there's this really interesting theory in sort of safety theories called normal accidents. And this is basically when you have sufficiently complex systems, like accidents are going to happen. And whenever you introduce autonomy, whenever you introduce computational systems, you may prevent some types of accidents, but you're going to have new kinds of accidents that you may not have predicted. One example, actually related to the fact that vehicles may not have steering wheels, up here on the left, this is a crash between a small 12-person shuttle vehicle on the Las Vegas Strip that has crashed with a large semi-truck. What has happened here is that the vehicle actually stopped. The truck was pulling out, and it just didn't see it. And it was a slow motion, just ran into it. Now, what's interesting, this entire time, there's actually a CDL, a commercial driver license operator, who's there to kind of maintain things. They're sitting there watching it all happen with people in the thing. No one was hurt, mostly just scratched at the vehicle. They didn't have a steering wheel. All they had was an Xbox controller that didn't really work. Because, and if I remember correctly, like it didn't have a reverse on the controller. So they weren't actually trained, because the whole idea was like, you're not supposed to drive the car with this thing. So he actually had no training about how to use the thing, but he could see it. He could say, "Hey, wait, we just need to back up." Like they're not like, "Hey, buddy, you can't see us." So all of a sudden here, you have this new kind of crash, weird low speed crash. Fortunately, again, no one was hurt, but the designers of this didn't really take this into consideration. Like, wait, maybe we should give some way for operators to control this. And maybe an Xbox controller is or isn't a good interface. Now, there's more research to be done. I don't actually want to claim that these interfaces can't be good. However, there needs to be consideration put into them. Another example is another small scale. This is on the picture on the right. This was at the Tokyo Olympics. What happened here was that this is an autonomous shuttle, and there were, again, safety operators on board. This vehicle didn't have a steering wheel, but it had a joystick. There was somebody crossing the road ahead. Now, the vehicle was in motion and it had stopped, but they didn't know. The person was like, well, are they going to cross? Or they must have seen us, they're not going to cross. And the person had actually overridden, and they said, no, I guess the vehicle stopped, but like, let's keep going. Well, it turned out the person who was crossing the crosswalks actually was, had a loss of vision. So they were blind. They were a Paralympian. They didn't see it. Sorry, a little loud there on the mic. And they got hit. Low speed, again, there wasn't a huge sort of medical emergency of this, though they are an Olympic athlete and they just got hit by a bus, which is not particularly a good thing for them. But what's interesting here is that the operators just didn't know. There wasn't enough communication. They didn't know what was going on, and they actually overrode the system. So again, it's something to think about here, these new kinds of accidents that can occur. And these accidents, one of the things that's really important is that sometimes people like to say, especially in the case that there is like, well, that was, user operator. It's an operator error, right? They shouldn't have overrode that. The system was better. That's not really the case here. These things, and it's not also autonomy failure. It's the human autonomy team. That's where the failure occurs. Actually, the complexity of those things, that's where the failures occur. And that's the thing we need to be thinking about, rather than these sort of one-sided views of like, okay, operators fail or autonomy fails. So that's one of the interesting things that we think needs probably some more work and exploration. All right, big table here, but I want to just talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons that we sort of see across varying levels of autonomy. So here in the black column, you've got sort of the SAE levels of automation, sort of 0 to 5. And we just were thinking about some of the positives and negatives of each. I'll kind of highlight a couple, mostly thinking about, so we could just say, well, hey, this is too much, too complicated. Let's not put any autonomy in. That being said, there's a lost opportunity there, right? There could be ways, and we've spoken with drivers who have said things like, hey, my car has like a backup camera. It's got these awesome radar sensors. I've got blind spot detection. Why can't I have this in the bus, right? So it's not that, there's people are saying, no, I don't want anything. There are some things that people are excited about that they could potentially benefit. So there's an opportunity cost of not doing anything. So we do still believe that automation does have a place in transit. However, we just need to be thoughtful about where it should be and how it interacts with trained operators in their work. Now, if we step forward, I'll jump here, partial automation, level 2. There could be some workload reduction. So level 2 automation, this is things like adaptive cruise control, maybe some lane centering, but you're still mostly in control of the vehicle. One of the things here, though, is we think that this is not particularly useful in really complex urban environments. It works really well on the freeway, which is actually where a lot of vehicles now are doing level 2 systems. They work well on the freeway where you have lots of space between you, you're mostly in one lane, and you're driving forward. Buses are operating start and stop, really tight corners, cyclists going past them, scooters now. Soon you're going to have sidewalk robots. Talk to us about that later. Like, that's what the bus has to contend with. So we're not so sure that level 2. So actually we think that the higher levels of automation are really where there could be some more benefits, but also some more challenges. So looking here, I'll jump ahead to kind of level 4. That's really high automation. This is where we start to imagine that there's going to be issues of things like skill atrophy, right? When the systems take over too much, then that's when operators may start to lose their abilities. However, that becomes really important when the automation fails, not if, but when it doesn't work, and you have to revert. And especially what's going to happen, this is another really interesting thing about these failures, is that these failures typically occur in the hardest situations to navigate as a human. So rather than an automation saying, I can't automate, but please continue driving straight at a constant speed on a freeway, it's there's a huge snowstorm. The power is now down. There's no lights anymore. I can't do anything. The bus is covered in ice. You drive. And so now the humans are basically being tasked to just work in the hardest of conditions, which is really interesting. So you're having the automation take over the easy parts, and then the humans are sort of now in some ways might even need more training because now they have to be to work in those situations that are most difficult. So a couple things here. Feel free to check out the report for more. We go into more depth on all these things. But again, we got con and big and red and stuff. We think there are challenges. Again, though, but please, there are potential benefits. And we do think that we're excited to explore, especially working with operators to understand where those benefits may lie. Sarah.
Yeah, and I think just kind of adding to this question of kind of additional burdens is also the quality of the job. So how operators feel about their work on the day-to-day. So if it's constantly stressful, or if they're experiencing skill atrophy, that affects the sense of dignity or pride that one has in their job. So that's also something to think about. So a couple of things we want to highlight in addition to this work on human AI teaming is also who manages the problems when they arise. So as it stands today, most automated vehicle technology has only been proven in kind of near ideal conditions, as we were talking about before. The beautiful kind of new roads compared to Pittsburgh of California, and weather conditions that are sunny and dry. However, the world is anything but ideal. For example, during heavy rains in New York City, an operator managed to safely transport passengers with a water-filled bus. So thinking about, again, these kind of heightened intensified conditions and how operators have to take over when streets are flooded. And as we know, with the kind of changing climate, these intense weather conditions are likely to only increase. So, in addition to that, thinking about cyclists and pedestrians on the road and the safety, a lot of, we've talked to operators, a lot of them have mentioned, especially on college campuses, not to put us on the hook, but people darting out, not on a crosswalk, but instead, when they need to get to class, whatever it may be. So there are things that you just need to be kind of aware of as an operator and kind of be ready for. We talked to one operator in the Poconos who said, they regularly encounter deer, for example, and depending on where you operate, that might be something that's pretty frequent.
Some questions from online.
Uh-huh.
Do we have a sense the SAE level that is the most safe at the moment for large scale deployment, like in bus transits?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll just repeat it here. So is there a sense of what SAE level is most safe for bus transit? That's a good question. And I think right now, so currently, we don't have examples of higher than level 2, really. So it's unclear. Like, we can't actually say like these, they might be, but we don't actually have examples of those operations.
There are pilots proposed.
There are pilots proposed, but we don't have them in sort of large enough numbers to really get a sense of that. I would sort of argue right now that given the information that we have, lower levels of automation with highly trained operators is probably going to maintain safety. But as time goes on, we may find the specific areas where higher levels of automation or higher levels of automation around specific tasks may help to improve safety, but the research still needs to be done in regards to that.
Examples include docking, for example. That
Yeah.
was something that operators appreciate where it's present. and feels like an assistant or an improvement on driving conditions.
How long are the training protocols for operators? 2 weeks, 3 weeks? Do they need to know driving before? Or have a driving license, for example? And can there be ways to allow driver inputs at real time in automated vehicles?
So this is status quo, like this is right now, is the
Yes.
question? Okay. We should repeat the question.
Just
Yeah.
very quick, it was the question for those in the room, if you didn't hear, was about current training times. How much training do people receive? How much is it weeks? Is it months? Do they have to have a license? And then the last part of the question, let me answer that. Let's answer that first.
Yeah.
Driver inputs. Okay, first thing, all transit bus operators are a commercial driver. They have a commercial driver's license. That requires them, that's a next level up, allows them to ride larger vehicles. That training, I believe, is on the order of months. Interestingly, we've spoken with drivers. Let's say you get a new bus. So a new bus comes in. How much training time do you get with that new bus? It depends. If, for example, a municipality is going to bring in something like an articulated bus, those are the big bendy buses, 2 of them, that actually they train drivers on for a series of probably weeks. And you've probably even seen, bus in training or like in training. That is something because they need to learn how to operate such a large vehicle. That being said, if a bus comes in, let's say it's a 40-foot bus, your standard bus size has but it's all fancy and new controls, new this and that. We've talked to operators who say they get about 5 minutes.
It depends.
Like someone
wildly.
yeah.
Yeah, like
Someone comes in and says, here's your new bus for the day. Oh yeah, here's some features.
it could be kind of almost like telephone style where like one person got a demo and an introduction by the vendor offering the technology, and then it becomes kind of passed along to other operators, or it could be dedicated. It kind of depends on the authority, the transit authority, and what they're able to invest in, probably the vendor as well. So what they offer when you purchase a new bus or fleet.
Right. Yeah. So I realize, like I said that, and you're kind of like, yeah, you're like you're thinking like 5 weeks, 5 days, no, 5 minutes. No, literally. I mean, people have said like, yes, I come in and they like, I have a new bus. I'm like, I don't even know how to open the door. It's the door thing changed. And someone's like, oh, here's how you do it. They're like, basically one of the metaphors someone said is like, sometimes they treat it like, oh, it's like just like getting a new phone, right? Like if I hand you the new version of your iPhone, or even if you want iPhone to Android or something, you're like, yeah, you probably figure it out. That's not exactly how the operators we've spoken with feel about it, although they say that's kind of how it can feel. This has come up a lot. This is something operators we've spoken with are very vocal about, training and potential improvements to training. It becomes especially important when new technologies get brought in. Let's say, for example, you have a technology that's using a sensor-based system to help with driving. Actually having an understanding, at least a general conceptual model of how that system works to understand when it's failing would likely be important. So yeah, there was a question on controls, I think, there as well at the end of that.
Driver input.
Yeah, can there be ways to allow driver inputs in real time in automated vehicles?
When you say driver inputs in real time, I guess
The override?
might be, yeah, it's okay. I'll answer the question that we think. We'll answer the question that we think we heard, and then if it's another, please ask again, or we can in the conversation. So right now, currently, vehicles still are required by law to maintain a number of the same controls. However, people are getting permits to allow them to run vehicles that don't have controls in them. To be honest, from the research that we've been doing and we've kind of conducted, we're not sure that's the greatest approach right now, because people haven't figured out how to design good controls yet. Like there isn't good new patterns of better controls. In addition, remember, commercially trained drivers, these are people with years of experience knowing how to work with the controls that they have. And so, yeah, so I mean, I think
just
that,
think back to the examples of the Xbox and the joystick and the problems that
exactly.
because of that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you know, I think that are there ways to allow for real-time input? Yeah, you can maintain those controls. You can have a driver. There's actually been some really interesting work about thinking about how do drivers nudge, like, oh, I just want, like, the system is doing fine, it's just over a little bit, I want to nudge it. I have some friends who are doing that, so there is work in that, but I'm not sure that design patterns exist right now in the industry of like new kinds of controls or new ways to sort of allow for maybe not direct, like 100% I'm in control of the vehicle, but like sort of elements, like moments of control where I'm kind of coming to control and then I'm going to step back. Those patterns haven't entirely been figured out yet.
I mean, and there's plenty of room. I think this is a really interesting research opportunity is to think about kind of experimental design that might test between different interface options and really think about kind of optimizing in cases where operators are really used to a particular style. So how to move between autonomy and user input or driver input, I think could be a really interesting question. But again, it might be a theme across the report in general. There's a need for kind of standardization, whether it be training, so standards on how much time, so 5 minutes is probably not enough, we'll venture to say, and then also the kinds of controls, if there are controls, even though that's being debated. All right, so we're just gonna want to reflect for a moment on kind of bus operations and the high level of safety that they do offer. So they're safer than personal vehicles. So an average of 40 fatalities in the United States per year versus the 23,000 on personal vehicles. So there's a pretty stark difference there. So again, kind of let's re-emphasize the importance of trained operators and the roles that they play in keeping our roadways safe and transporting people where they need to go. And like we were describing before, there are opportunities to incorporate a novel safety technologies, kind of augmenting that high level of safety even more. So, and just to highlight a couple of things, so we've been talking about kind of the roadway and safety there, but there are also concerns on the bus. So the roles that operators play in attending to the needs of, say, elderly passengers or passengers with disabilities who may require assistance kind of boarding the bus or being secured into their seat. And operators, unfortunately, regularly manage onboard situations like assaults. You may have seen in the news a kind of heightened level of assaults amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and things don't look to be going downward that way either. And also medical situations. So what happens if somebody experiences a heart attack or a stroke or another kind of medical emergency on the bus? Who's going to be there, you know, if we're in a driverless situation to contact emergency assistance and help them navigate to the right corner, for example. So just kind of thinking about how to assess and address the problems in advance, we recognize that the importance of kind of preventing recognizing that there are going to be unforeseeable circumstances, medical emergencies, weather conditions, whatever it may be, and being ready for that, being ready and prepared. So it's important for transit operators and equipment suppliers and federal regulators all to work in concert with each other to coordinate safety planning. So there has been some safety planning around kind of up to level 2, but we would argue there needs to be more around 3 to 5. And it needs to be conducted with local authorities as well involved. So the resources available to kind of New York City transit authority is very different to what might be available in the Poconos, for example. I used that example earlier with the deer. So safety planning and training will change depending on the kind of weather conditions, the infrastructural conditions, and those other road users, whether it be human or animal, like I was suggesting.
Great, so just as a kind of recap, we'll just put up some of our recommendations up on the screen again for people to take a look at. Again, today we talked a little bit about the first and the fourth ones, addressing the new and potential issues that may occur, these new kinds of accidents, the new burdens that can be placed on transit operators, and then also discussing a little bit about when problems arise, how do we, or when thinking about these problems, how can we kind of prevent them, how can we think about them ahead of time. And throughout all of our work, we are really interested, I've mentioned before, Sarah and I have been connected with actual on the ground transit workers, with their unions. These are the people who are actually driving buses today to try to learn about the realities of what it actually takes to operate such a large piece of machinery safely in a public in a public situation. And so that's one of the things we're continuing that with our work. We also think this is an important thing moving forward for others who are in this space to make sure that we're including stakeholders across varying levels, right? This includes at the federal level, at the state level, at the municipal level, at the rank and file union worker level. How is this technology potentially going to impact the operations of public transit? So to end, we actually have a question for you all, given some of the things we spoke today. We're curious if you have thoughts about any kinds of complexities that you might foresee with increased levels of autonomous vehicle technology or advanced driver assistance technologies in public transportation, whether for those operators or for yourselves as transit riders or as pedestrians who are on the street and next to such automated vehicles.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, we're just like.
I have a few more questions.
Yeah, great.
Okay, during your interviews with bus drivers, did you learn about any additional critical tasks or functions that the drivers are doing beyond actually driving the vehicle? For example, social monitoring, helping people into a vehicle. And how should we be thinking about these tasks as part of the design of automated transit systems?
Yes, absolutely. We heard from drivers again and again that expecting the unexpected is actually the job. So it could be helping people on board. It could be helping in cases of emergency, like we mentioned before. It could be helping riders with disabilities secure into seats, for example, which is a federal requirement, not applied to kind of other shared rideshare kind of technologies, for example. So it's a necessary kind of infrastructure for people to get around. We mentioned this is essential. So yeah, certainly, and I think the question, there have been some technologies, in fact, that operators brought up to us that help in securement, for example, of riders with disabilities, but it's not widespread. It's kind of an added feature that might be kind of an additional cost. So it was something that they, again, kind of could augment their daily work, but it wasn't the norm yet. So that's one example. Are there others where like critical tasks that you can recall that we've heard?
Yeah, there's a couple, there's two things. So again, as Sarah had mentioned, there's a lot of this area of safety and personal safety, public safety. Just a driver being there can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
We heard stories, for example, some patrons of the bus can be, they may interact with people in ways that are not what you're used to, maybe make you a little uncomfortable. But the reality is,
just to be really explicit, we heard about, moments of sexual harassment, for example, where the operator had to step in and protect another passenger and kind of, boot the offending passenger off. It's difficult to see how that might work in a driverless situation unless there was a kind of attendant on board. And again, how is the attendant also supervising, for example, the roadway, et cetera. So so that's definitely one we heard. We heard another actually of a child. Do you want to share that one?
Yeah, so there was an operator there was a child who had just not gotten off. They had just stayed on the bus. And at the end of the line, the operator realized, wait a minute, you didn't get off. Where are you supposed to go? And they're like, I'm supposed to be at school. So they actually, then it was actually the end of their shift, but they spent time figuring out, saying, we're going to get you to where you need to go. I think they actually took their personal vehicle to help get them back to their parents. But these are the kinds of things that can happen. You may have seen there's been an interesting, there's been news cases, even I think only a month ago, children who are lost in the street and bus drivers stopping to see. So they're not only helping people on the bus, but they're also helping people on the roadway. That's another interesting aspect of this, is they're acting also as someone, their eyes on the road and helping people outside of the bus, but they do provide that public support capability. The other thing too, and then Stan, I'll have you ask a question, is just actually there's elements of just understanding the mechanics of the bus. Like we've actually talked to a lot of bus drivers who are like, something is broken, something is wrong. And like, they're actually the first line of like, I'm going to try to figure it out. I'm going to call in to the tech support, to their maintenance crews, figure out what's going on, help people make sure there's a new bus coming in. So that's another thing, like these are big mechanical things, and they're, you know, tires are going to pop, gearboxes are going to fail. Like, these things can happen. And so how are those situations going to be managed? So that's another thing. They provide that role there, both for the maintenance staff to figure out what to do, but also then that customer service.
Kind of translating, yeah.
Yeah.
So are there kind of standard processes among the federal government to all the states, and with the states to all these agencies out there? How's that kind of structured, and how, you know, how can recommendations be advanced through that system? Is that a very organized system?
It feels like a lead.
Yeah. So it depends. It depends on what you're talking about. So, for example, the public safety agency plans that we had mentioned briefly in the talk, those are things that are mandated by the federal government, by the Federal Transportation Administration. If you're going to receive funding from the government to support your public transit operations, you need to go and create one of these plans. What's interesting is that the plans, the support that's given to create these plans is sort of like, well, you know, make one. And it depends on where you're at. If you're New York City, yeah, you've got an office that is doing this. You have an office and a whole team of people because you have a huge operation. If you are in a much smaller, say a rural community, you may not have anyone actually, but your whole operation might be the maintenance staff, the operators, and maybe a manager. You might not have, for example, a public safety plan. And so people are building off of plans. This is something where we're kind of considering, I think we had mentioned, for example, the hazard analysis, so thinking about problems that could occur. It's important, and we think that there are ways and there are operations that happen at the federal level. The Federal Motor Carrier Association is doing this. However, they even note recommendations that individual agencies need to do this. However, actually, there was a whole research study on this of like how good our small agencies are doing this. And again, the same thing came up. Well, it depends. If you're New York City, if you've got a big operation, it's fine. If you're small, you're understaffed. I mean, it seems really obvious, but unfortunately, that's the reality that we are working with. So yeah, it's not standardized. Actually, there's a lot of this stuff actually operates at the municipality level. I mean, these are companies that are basically running at the local level.
So in your opinion, just from all the kind of research you did with this, as a follow-on question to that, would it be, is it easier or safer to try to deploy these technologies with big, you know, bureaucratic organizations with staff, or with more nimble organizations, but maybe that have not a lot of capacity? What would, and again, just from your opinion out there and what you're hearing from the bus drivers, what, you know, who do you think is better at these early deployments?
You know, I think bureaucracy could be a good thing in this situation. Again, when concern for safety is so high. I don't know that we've talked to operators that have been in municipalities where there are pilots happening. It's mostly been we've mostly discussed it in the kind of like broader strokes where it's something they see on the horizon, they see it kind of coming down the pike, but it hasn't necessarily been a kind of day-to-day interaction for them yet. Yeah, I mean, so that would be my response. And it might be, you might be able to kind of pilot something more quickly, but that's not necessarily a good thing in this case.
Thank you.
There was a question here, and then there.
I was wondering, is there any like specific technology that is either being implemented more widely right now, or like that you foresee is coming up that transit agencies are going to adopt, like bus docking, or like, is there anything?
Yeah, so two technologies. Bus docking is one. So bus docking, this is when a bus pulls up to like a ramped area that is like a big curb. There's a thing to get on and off. This is actually a pretty challenging situation for drivers to manage, because they want to be very, very close to the dock, but it also means it's really easy to like scrape the bus, and that no one feels good about. I mean, imagine scraping your car or something. Like, you'd feel pretty bad, especially if you're a professional driver. And in addition to that, it's cost on that bus. So that's one area. That's actually one area where we've heard bus drivers say, "Oh, this is great."
Yeah.
It's usually slower. It's usually a lot slower than someone coming in. So you kind of maybe lose some efficiency, but people are like, "No, that's cool. I don't want to scrape the bus." Another area is in bus rapid transit. So this is where you've got specialized lanes where basically now it's the bus freeway. Only the bus is there. that actually is an area where there's more talk and potentially more opportunity, because now you're utilizing systems like lane centering and cruise control. And honestly, if there's no one ahead of you, just even standard cruise control, that's an area where we are seeing more kind of sort of successful pilots being done. Now, that being said, they're still like testing it. There are, even when that occurs, there are still been documented cases of errors happening. One thing was
In Columbus.
yeah. So, but those are two areas where the technologies are sort of probably a little more ready. Here and then there.
Is there any way to model or predict the number of accidents you might save by eliminating or reducing human error? You know, if you have autonomous guidelines in place versus the number of accidents that might be created, like the new crashes you were talking about, where there's an interaction between the human and the system that wasn't anticipated.
That's a good question.
Yeah, do you recall from the data around fatalities, like whether there was incident attached
That's one
to
of
it?
the-
Yeah, the
yeah.
description of like why the fatality happened or why the incident happened.
Unfortunately, a lot of the data isn't that we've found, at least at the government level, isn't that, because it's a really interesting question, because you look at like 40 a year, that's not very much. The other thing too is you got to drop down, well, what does that mean? Like, it's possible that is it caused by, say, a crash, or is it just caused by someone having an unfortunate heart attack while riding a bus? The other thing that we don't know is the difference between in vehicle and out of vehicle. In many cases, it's oftentimes it's actually the out of vehicle
Interaction with
right. So a
vulnerable-
cyclist,
yeah.
a pedestrian or something, that's where a lot of the things are. And to your question of modeling this stuff, that's a good question. I don't know. I feel like we should ask Corey.
Yeah,
Corey-
Corey, our collaborator.
Yeah,
Corey
Corey
Harper.
Harper is one of our other collaborators. He does a lot of modeling and stuff. So it's possible, and I'm sure that people are trying to do this. The question on the new crashes, that one is a little harder.
It is, yeah.
Because like, how do you, it's so like a lot of these, one of the challenges with these things is that they're sort of the emergent things that they're so hard to think about, like where the interactions. I mean, I know we this whole talk, we're like, you should think about it. You should try to preemptively think about these things. But even then, it's still a really challenging thing to do. So,
I mean, one thing, you could have a rougher estimate, like taking into consideration existing pilots, the conditions under which they operate, and the kinds of
it's true, yeah.
crashes that happened there, but it wouldn't be exact by any means.
It'd be a cool research project.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be a super cool research project. Actually, try to estimate those things. There's a question here.
Yeah, and so my question is in mega cities, especially New York or Chicago, there are a lot of high buildings. As an interruption of the GPS signal,
Yeah.
Mhm.
do you see any policy regulations currently implemented on these new buildings or any kind of policies? That is one, do you see there are any, or do you think there should be any? And the two is how do we decrease our over reliance on this GPS system? I'm not sure if I'm framing it
Yeah.
correctly, but these two, how to tackle these two issues.
Yeah, so on the GPS side of things, you're right. So the issue that's being discussed is the fact that when you get into a urban canyon, your GPS, basically you don't have as many satellites that are in view, and so your GPS can decrease. This can be changed. This can be alleviated with different technologies. If you have repeaters that are actually transmitting, and you can actually start changing it. So that's a good question. I don't know of anything right now that's going to add regulations to say improve that, but I could imagine that. The other thing too is that many autonomous technologies are also leveraging localized mapping. So they're utilizing digital maps of the environment, as well as they're creating live maps using LiDAR sensors. And so they're positioning themselves within an environment fairly accurately, which is not GPS based. So it's based on pre-known data plus updates to the scan, the 3D scanning of the environment. And those do seem to help a lot.
Yeah, and it,
Yeah.
like if you've seen any one of the kind of AV companies, vehicles driving around town, that's likely what they're doing is mapping.
Yeah, those ones
Yeah.
kind of spinning LiDAR and stuff like that. So those can help. But it's an interesting question about what kinds of, so this is something that we don't dive a ton into in this report, but there's an interesting question there of infrastructure enhancements. So if you do want to have this stuff, what types of infrastructure do you need to happen to be improved? That's definitely something that needs to be discussed at the federal and the local, state and local levels, because that's now infrastructure money, not private company AV money. Although that's likely where you may start to see some really important gains in AV capabilities is by actually having infrastructure that helps to alleviate some of the challenges that occur when you try to just do everything on board. Yes.
So based on your interview or interaction with the industry people, we have two type of modes for the future. One might be fully autonomous vehicle, another might be a operator with some advanced decision support systems. Which type do you say more likely to be the trend for future?
Depends on when in the future you're talking about. We have strong opinion about which way it might be safer that we share in the report, which is to still have a trained operator on board. That's a recommendation that we make fairly clear. So yeah, but I think there is a kind of race to a driverless future. But again, as Nick mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the kind of endpoint of that race seems to move, like, the goalpost seems to move every so often, so, 2020, 2025, 2030. And so in the interest of ensuring kind of safe operations, we recommend that trained operators remain. Thank you.
How feasible is it for this technology to be applied into the conventional bus transit? Because the example that you show, it's just like a small pod that have a capacity for 12 passengers.
Yeah.
And it seemed like it have to run in a fixed route that the program generated.
Yeah, it's a good question of like how feasible are the technologies transferring over to say your 40-foot standard bus or even your 80-foot articulated bus. So there currently are some New Flyer as a company that makes buses. They do have new buses that are coming out that have some of these technologies built in, and they're looking to pilot those. So it is feasible, totally possible. We can make the vehicles drive on their own. The question has to really do, I think, a lot with the operating environments. Again, a lot of those pod-based systems are working in fairly controlled areas. Think a college campus where there's maybe not so much vehicle traffic, although there's a lot of pedestrian traffic. But that's still very different from, say, either a downtown, like a Pittsburgh downtown, or even a very rural area where actually you have long stretches roadway with very little around you, but then things that can happen and change very quickly. So the technologies are definitely possible, and I would definitely check out. So New Flyer, I think also, trying to remember, there was another bus company. New Flyer is the one that I think they've got some of the most advanced technology when it comes to transit. Like think your standard transit bus, putting those technologies in.
Just to build up on that question about feasibility, so it seems like we're trying to go to that level 2. So let's say that okay, we reach that point, and is there any study or research on how that would cost in terms of the long run versus just simply rail? Because it seems like rail seems to be running greater now, and
oh boy,
Well, there, yeah.
all the sensors, LiDAR, and everything. But it's not just the cost of the buying sensors; it's the cost of maintaining that sensors. So I was just wondering, what if it ends up even we waste more dollars on that instead of just.
It depends on, well, yeah, I mean, it depends on where, we talked about kind of rural context. Seems unlikely that rail would be built there. But if you're thinking about dense urban areas, I mean, I think this sounds like another really good project, maybe teaming up with an economist could be interesting. But yeah, I mean, the infrastructural costs on both, I mean, it would be really interesting to compare. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a big opportunity to look into that further. It does seem like to me, just on first blush, that rail would be quite expensive and not necessarily cover the same degree that buses could.
Yeah, buses really do provide critical transportation to areas that are not served by rail. And you're always going to have that unless you're really putting rail everywhere. And there are places, but one thing you have to think about is the design of cities. I'll say just to be totally upfront, we're taking a pretty US centric view here. We do look at international work, but we're operating in the US. We're thinking about US transportation, laws and things like that. So we're also thinking about US cities. Los Angeles is, for example, where I'm from, is just never really going to be set up for, like, we just have too much infrastructure. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say never, but like, you may have to think about redesigning the way people live, which I think is interesting. And I think that maybe looking at some of the economic costs there, and I agree with
And even
Sarah.
in Pittsburgh,
Yeah.
I mean, doing an evaluation here, a projection here could be interesting,
Right.
considering like the T that we have and how limited that is. But, yeah.
Oh yeah, we have there is, I've taken it once. Oh no, I didn't take it. It didn't come. And then there were leaves on the track. So I ended up walking across the bridge. Another thing just to think about there, this is and again, very US centric, is just the nature of like who pays. So rail and infrastructure is often paid for by tax dollars, right? It's not usually these days, it's not really private companies who are coming in and investing in that. Whereas right now you've got all these private companies who are saying, cool, we're going to dump money and we're going to make these buses and we're going to turn this into a business.
But eventually the transit authority does pay.
That's true.
Yeah, in terms of the fleets.
Right, but just to think about just in the US, just the way that things are, like, you have to probably put a ballot measure on and raise funds and things like that. And then now you've got a socio-political problem, challenge to kind of work with. So I think it's a super interesting question, actually. Yeah, if you're an economist or if you know someone, like, that would be a really cool thing to do because, I mean, yeah, rail is really good. That being said, I do think that a mixed mobility systems, there's likely going to be need for some form of bus or shared ride transit, no matter where you are. Even in, the most dense of cities, there usually is still some type of bus operation or shared ride operation to get people to where the rails just aren't yet, or may not likely be because of economic reasons. Are we doing out of time? We should wrap it up. Okay.
Maybe one more?
Yeah, one more question, or we could just be done. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks all for coming.